Davenport, Iowa, November 29, 1986. It was a Saturday, cold and grey, the kind of November day that makes the whole world feel like it's holding its breath. Cary Grant had been scheduled to appear in a one-man show that evening, a conversation with an audience, the kind of intimate event he had taken to doing in his later years. He was 82 years old. He had been looking forward to it. He never made it to the stage. He suffered a massive stroke in his hotel room that afternoon. By 11:22 that night, Cary Grant was gone. When the news broke, Hollywood went quiet in the way it only goes quiet when someone genuinely irreplaceable has left. Not the performed grief of press statements and publicists, the real kind, the kind that catches you in the middle of something ordinary and stops you completely. Audrey Hepburn was at home in Switzerland when she heard. She sat down. She didn't speak for a long time. The people who were with her that night said she simply went somewhere else, somewhere interior and private, and stayed there. What she did in the days that followed would leave everyone who witnessed it unable to speak. To understand what that friendship meant, you have to go back to 1963. Charade, shot in Paris, released that autumn to audiences who immediately understood they were watching something rare. Two people on screen who genuinely delighted in each other. Cary was 59 that year. Audrey was 34. The age gap that might have made things awkward in lesser hands became between them a kind of elegance. He was witty, and she was warm, and together they made a film that felt less like a production and more like a conversation between two people who happened to be extraordinarily gifted. But what the cameras didn't capture was what happened between takes. Cary Grant was, by most accounts, a complicated man, brilliant and guarded, charming in public and solitary in private. He had been married 4 times. He had spent decades constructing Cary Grant, the persona, the polish, the perfection, and the distance between that construction and the man underneath it. Archibald Leach from Bristol, England, was something he rarely allowed anyone to see. He allowed Audrey to see it. She was the same way. She understood from the inside what it cost to be a public person, to give your face and your voice and your presence to an audience, night after night, year after year, while the private self stayed hidden, protected, slowly losing its shape from disuse. They recognized each other in the way that people who carry the same kind of weight sometimes do, not through conversation, through something quieter than conversation. They became, over the years that followed Charade, what could only be described as genuine friends. Not Hollywood friends, not the kind held together by proximity and mutual benefit and the gentle fiction of the industry. Real ones, the kind who called each other on ordinary days for no particular reason, the kind who told each other the truth. By 1986, Audrey had been largely retired from acting for nearly a decade. She was living the life she had always wanted. The Swiss house, the garden, her son Sean, the dogs, the mornings that belonged to nobody but her. She had found in her 50s a kind of peace that had eluded her for most of her adult life. Cary had retired in 1966, 20 years earlier, at the height of his powers. He simply decided to stop. He married Barbara Harris in 1981 and became, in those final years, something he had never quite managed to be before, genuinely happy. His daughter Jennifer was born in 1966, and fatherhood had done something to him that nothing else had been able to do. It had made him present in a way the cameras and the studios and the personas had never allowed. He and Audrey spoke on the phone regularly. People who knew both of them would say that those conversations were different from most conversations. Either of them had, looser, funnier, more honest. Two people who had nothing left to prove to each other and therefore nothing left to perform. The last time they spoke was 3 weeks before Davenport. By all accounts it was an ordinary call, nothing that announced itself as final. They talked about Jennifer, they talked about Barbara. Cary mentioned the upcoming tour, the conversation shows he had been doing. Audrey mentioned her garden, the particular problem of Swiss winters, a book she had been reading. They made each other laugh several times. Then they said goodbye, the way they always said goodbye, warmly, without urgency, with the assumption that there would be another call. There wasn't. The service was held on December 12, 1986, at the Paramount Studios lot in Hollywood. Barbara Grant had wanted something that reflected who Cary actually was. Not the legend, not the icon, but the man. The service was intimate by Hollywood standards. 150 people, family, close friends, a few colleagues from the years that mattered most. Audrey flew in from Switzerland. She had not been asked to speak. She had not been asked to do anything except attend, to be present, to grieve alongside the people who had loved him. That was enough. That was, for most people, all anyone could manage. She arrived quietly, the way she always arrived places. She was 57 years old, and the beauty that had defined her in the public imagination had softened into something harder to name and more affecting, the face of a woman who had lived carefully and felt everything. She wore black, simply cut. She sat near the back. She did not seek attention, and attention sought her anyway, the way it always did, but she deflected it with a stillness that made people feel slightly ashamed of their own curiosity. The service began. Several people spoke. Kirk Douglas spoke about working with Cary. Gregory Peck spoke about what it had meant to know him. Frank Sinatra, visibly aged, visibly moved, spoke about a man who had somehow managed to be everything Hollywood claimed to value: gifted, elegant, decent, without being destroyed by any of it. Barbara Grant spoke last among the official eulogists. She was composed and honest, and it cost her everything to be both. She talked about the man she had married, not the star, the man who made breakfast on Sunday mornings and read to Jennifer at night and laughed at things that weren't supposed to be funny, and sometimes, in the evenings, sat very still and seemed to be listening to something nobody else could hear. The room was in pieces. Then something happened that nobody had planned. The minister indicated that the formal portion of the service was complete. There would be a moment of silence before the recessional music began. People prepared themselves for the ending, reached for handkerchiefs, looked at their hands, steadied themselves for the standing and the walking out into the cold December air. Audrey stood up. She didn't ask permission. She didn't look at the minister or at Barbara or at anyone in particular. She simply stood, and something in the quality of her standing, the completeness of it, the absolute absence of self-consciousness, made the entire room go still. She walked to the front. She had nothing in her hands. No notes, no paper, no written words to lean on. She stood at the simple wooden lectern and looked at the room, at the 150 faces looking back at her, and for a moment she said nothing. Then she said, "I'm not going to speak about Cary Grant." A pause. "I'm going to speak about Archie." The room shifted. Those who knew understood immediately. Those who didn't understand could feel that something true had just been said. Archibald Alexander Leach, born January 18, 1904 in Bristol, England. The name Cary Grant had never entirely replaced, just covered over, kept like something in a drawer that you don't look at often but don't throw away either. Audrey spoke for 7 minutes. Nobody timed it. The 7 minutes came from accounts gathered afterward, from the people who were there and who tried, in the days and weeks that followed, to reconstruct what she had said and why it had affected them the way it did. She did not tell the famous stories. She did not mention the films. She did not cite the performances that had become part of the cultural vocabulary of the 20th century. She spoke about things almost nobody in that room knew, the things Cary had told her in the years of their friendship, the things he had allowed her to see that he didn't allow most people to see. She talked about Bristol, about the childhood he had described to her once, late in a conversation that had started about something else entirely and then gone somewhere neither of them expected. A childhood defined by absence, his mother institutionalized when he was 9, his father distant and then gone, a boy left largely to raise himself in a city that had no particular use for him. She said that Archie Leach had constructed Cary Grant not as a vanity project but as a survival strategy. He had built someone better equipped for the world than he was, someone with more grace, more ease, more lightness, and then spent 60 years trying to close the distance between himself and his own creation. She said that in the years she had known him, she had watched that distance shrink, that the man who had called her 3 weeks before his death was closer to Archie than he had ever been, that Jennifer had done that, that Barbara had done that, that the quiet life he had chosen, the retirement that baffled so many people who thought fame was irreversible, had been the bravest thing he ever did. She said, "He told me once that he'd spent most of his life being Cary Grant for other people, and that what he wanted before the end was to just be Archie for a while, for himself." She stopped. "I think he got that," she said. "I think he had it, and I'm grateful because I knew both of them, and Archie was the better one." She walked back to her seat. The room did not applaud. Applause would have been wrong, too small, too ordinary for what had just happened. Instead there was silence, and in that silence something that could only be described as recognition. The feeling of having heard something true spoken in a place where truth is usually managed and softened and made presentable. Barbara Grant was weeping openly. She had known Audrey was going to say something. Audrey had told her that morning she wanted to speak, if that was acceptable, just a few words, but she had not known what. Nobody had known what. And what Audrey had said was not a few words. It was everything. It was the most precise and most loving description of the man Barbara had married that anyone had ever put into language. Kirk Douglas, who had not cried during his own eulogy, was crying now. Frank Sinatra had his face turned away from the room. After the service, people gathered in the way people gather after funerals, in clusters, with plates of food they don't eat, in conversations that start about the deceased and gradually become about the living. The particular awkward relief of having made it through. Audrey stood with Barbara for a long time, not talking, particularly, just standing. Barbara held her hand, and Audrey let her, and they were simply two women standing together in the aftermath of losing someone they had both loved, which is one of the most ordinary and most profound things that can happen to a person. A man Audrey didn't know well, a director who had worked with Cary in the 1950s, approached her. He told her what she had said had been the most beautiful eulogy he had ever heard. He asked her how she had known what to say. Audrey looked at him for a moment. "I just told the truth," she said. "Cary always told me the truth. It seemed only right to return the favor." She said it simply, without weight or performance, the way she said everything that actually mattered to her. The director nodded. He didn't have anything to add. Neither did anyone else. There is a photograph taken that day, outside the Paramount lot, as people were leaving. Someone with a camera, a journalist who had been allowed inside for the service and was waiting outside for the exit, caught Audrey in a moment she didn't know was being photographed. She is standing alone near a car, her coat collar turned up against the December cold. She is not looking at anything in particular. Her face is not composed in any deliberate way. It is just her face, at the end of a hard day, without the performance of anything. The photograph was published once, in a small industry newsletter, and then largely forgotten. People who have seen it say it is the most honest photograph ever taken of her, not the Givenchy, not the tiara, not the gazelle neck, and the enormous eyes arranged for the camera in any of the 1,000 famous images. Just a woman standing outside in the cold, after a funeral, looking like someone who has lost a friend, which is exactly what she was. In the years that followed, Audrey rarely spoke about Cary Grant in public. She deflected questions about him with characteristic grace, a brief acknowledgement, a warm word, a redirect toward his work or his legacy. The friendship, the real depth of it, stayed private, stayed hers. But in 1991, 2 years before her own death, she gave a long interview to a journalist she trusted. Near the end of it, the journalist asked about the people who had meant the most to her over the course of her life. She listed a few names: Mel, Sean, her mother, who had died in 1984. Then she was quiet for a moment. "Cary," she said. Cary understood something that very few people understand. The journalist asked what that was. Audrey thought about it. He understood that the person you show the world and the person you actually are don't have to be enemies, she said. That you can make peace between them, that it's hard and it takes a long time, but it's possible. He showed me that, by doing it. She paused. "I'm still working on it," she said, "but watching him do it gave me hope." Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn made one film together. 95 minutes of Charade that audiences have been returning to for 60 years because something in it refuses to age. Critics have offered many explanations: the script, the direction, the Paris locations, the chemistry. The chemistry. That word gets used a lot when people talk about Charade. And it's true, there is chemistry, but chemistry implies something combustible, something volatile, something that produces heat. What Cary and Audrey had on screen was different. It was more like recognition, the ease of two people who understood each other at some level that didn't require explanation, because they did understand each other. They were under the surface the same kind of person. Two people who had built magnificent public selves and spent their private lives quietly, carefully, trying to get back to whoever they had been before the magnificence. Two people for whom the work was real, but the life was more real. Two people who had learned, at some cost, that fame is a house you live in, but not a home. They found in each other something that neither of them found very easily in the world, someone who already knew the price of the thing and therefore didn't need it explained. That's what Audrey was trying to say. standing at that simple wooden lectern in December of 1986. She wasn't eulogizing a legend. She was saying goodbye to a friend, to Archie, to the man who had trusted her with the version of himself he didn't show most people. She was honoring that trust, the only way you can honor a trust when the person who gave it to you is gone, by keeping faith with it, by saying it out loud, by making sure that in the room full of people who had known Cary Grant, at least one person said the name Archie Leach and meant it. Audrey Hepburn died on January 20th, 1993. She was 63 years old. Her son Sean was with her. The house in Switzerland, the garden, the dogs, the life she had chosen over the life the world wanted for her was around her at the end. At her own funeral, someone who had been at Cary Grant's service said that what struck them most was the similarity, the same quality in the room, the same feeling that someone genuinely irreplaceable had left, and that the gap they left was not the gap of a famous person, but the gap of a real one, someone who had told the truth in rooms where truth was not required. Someone who had shown up, not for the cameras, not for the applause, not for the legacy, but for the people, for Archie, for all the Archies, the real people underneath the constructed ones, the ones who needed someone to see them. Audrey saw them. That was her gift. Not the face or the voice or the films, though all of those were magnificent. The seeing, the quality of her attention, turned on whoever was in front of her, completely and without condition. Cary Grant knew that. Marta from Trastevere knew that. The children in Ethiopia and Somalia and Bangladesh, who would never see a single frame of her work, knew that. And on a cold December morning in Hollywood, in a room full of people who had loved a man named Archie Leach, it was Audrey who gave him his name back. One last time, as a gift. If you love stories about the true friendships behind the famous faces, subscribe. These are the moments that don't make the highlight reels, but they're the ones that matter.